Good morning, Wabash. I'd like to welcome you all to the first chapel of the semester. Today's speaker is Dr. Bill Cook, who graduated from Wabash in 1966. While here, he was a history major, political science minor, and a member of Lambda Chi and the Glee Club, with which he was able to go on the first Glee Club trip to Europe in 1963. After graduating, he received the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship for Graduate Studies, which he used to earn his MA and PhD from Cornell in medieval history. From 1970 through the present, he has been in the history department at State University of New York in Geneseo, where he currently is a distinguished teaching professor. He mainly studies medieval church history, and specifically the life of St. Francis of Assisi and the movement he founded. He's the author of 5 books, one of which, titled The Medieval Worldview, is currently in the process of writing the 3rd edition. He received the first ever Cara Award for Excellence in Teaching Medieval Studies and has been a guest lecturer around the world, including Florence, Istanbul, Kyoto, numerous states, and soon plans to travel to the Slovak Republic. He has adopted 3 sons, been the legal guardian for 8 more, and had the pleasure of seeing one of them graduate from Wabash last year. Next year, he'll serve as a temporary replacement for Professor Plaker. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Cook for his chapel talk, Confessions of a Liberal Art Junkie.
The last time I stood alone on this stage, I was wearing wings. It's a long story, but to put it simply, the Lambda Chi's were doing a skit in an event that I think is no longer held the night before the DePaul game, and since we had a classical theme, I got to play a harpy. One of my many claims to fame as an undergraduate, most of which are not worth talking about. I want to talk a little bit about my experience at Wabash, not as a piece of nostalgia, not as a piece of history, but as a piece of talking about what I and you have in common, along with a select few but hearty group of people who have called Wabash their homes. When I entered the Lambda Chi house in 1962, we had many mottos, some of which of course are secret and I could not divulge even now, even assuming I could remember them. But one of our mottos was, not for 4 years, but for life. It sounded like a sentence at the time, but it turns out, not just for Lambda Chi, but for Wabash, it's not a sentence, it's a true statement. And I want to find some ways to reflect on that. When I came to Wabash, like I assume virtually all of you at the age of 18, I had one claim to fame in life. When my son came here 4 years ago, I heard Steve Klein list all the wonderful things that freshmen had done before they arrived here. And it sort of freaked me out because, you know, here's somebody that saved a beast, and here's somebody that cured a disease, and here's somebody who has, you know, practically been in space. My only claim to fame is that I was at the game on which the movie Hoosiers was based. 3 million Hoosiers claim that. 15,000 of us are telling the truth. When I came to Wabash, this was my life plan. To graduate from Wabash College, to major in political science, to go to law school and become a successful lawyer in Indianapolis and an elected Republican in the Indiana State Legislature. I was going to have a family of 2.5 children. I wanted to be exactly the national average. Have a house with a 1.75 garage, because that was the average size, and live in a lovely Indianapolis suburb. And I would spend my life active as a layperson in the Episcopal Church in which I grew up. Well, I achieved one of those goals. I graduated from Wabash. Everything else changed. And I want to try to explain why and how, because I think by telling a certain part of my story, I'm also telling a certain part of your story. I ran into Wabash, no doubt as some of you did, by accident. I was a sophomore at Tech High School in Indianapolis, and the college recruiters came. And as a student council member, I was assigned one of the college counselors to be his host. I hosted a guy named Carol Black, who was from Wabash College. As it turns out, not one student came to visit Carol Black all day. And so I had a prolonged conversation with Carol Black, and so my love affair with Wabash began. Between my junior and senior year, my parents and I trekked to Crawfordsville from Indianapolis. Before there was an Interstate 74 all the way, you had to go through backcountry, some of which we thought was barely explored, we who came from the grand city of Indianapolis. And I arrived and had an interview with a young man in the admissions office, a graduate of the class of 1960, named Fred Scott. Fred Scott, as it turns out, has been on the Board of Trustees and is a very successful businessman, first in Columbus, Indiana, and now in Georgia. Fred Scott was smart. Fred Scott was articulate. I looked at Fred Scott. I have no idea what he said, but what I realized is if I come to Wabash, I might sort of turn out like him. And that was a pretty impressive thought for me. And so I chose Wabash College and arrived on freshman, that's how times have changed, freshman Sunday. I sit in the chapel, and who gets to the podium? Byron K. Trippett. Byron K. Trippett, I assume you've seen his picture, was one of the handsomest human beings in the world. He should have been a movie star. He was brilliant and articulate and about 10 other things. And what Byron basically said to us and to our parents, who, like your parents, were a little bit nervous leaving us here, is if your kid works hard and graduates from Wabash like I did in the class of 1930, he might turn out to be a little bit like me. That was good enough for my parents, and that was good enough for me. I had two role models, one from the class of 60, one from the class of 30, and it could not have been any better. Like most of you, I had good SAT scores. I ranked high in my class. I was a muckety-muck on the Tech High School campus. I pledged Lambda Chi, and on the night before classes began, we had what was then called a lineup. And our senior pledge master, they don't have pledges at the Lambda Chi house anymore, I know, but we were pledges, trust me. He paced up and down the floor, sort of looking like this. Gentlemen, he said, we were impressed. We were impressed by your high school records. We were impressed by your leadership activities. And on and on and on. Gentlemen, we are impressed no more. Life just wasn't going to be the same here. I thought it'd be sort of easy because I went to a high school of 5,000 students and I was coming to this little tiny college of 800, and I thought if I could manage Tech High School, I could just take over Crawfordsville in a matter of minutes. They were no longer impressed by all that. And therefore, I had to go to work and I had to reconstruct who I was. Now, I had the best of all worlds when I came here. These names, some of them will mean nothing to you, but I want to talk about them a little bit. My first semester, this was my faculty lineup. Jack Charles, the premier lecturer in CC, which was our version of C&T. Bob Harvey, registrar of the college, who taught one section of freshman English. Jim Barnes, who like me was a rookie. He came to Wabash in 1962. Elliot Churchill Williams, known universally to students as Bugsy because of his specialization. He was a biologist. And a guy named Dick Strawn, who was my French professor. As it turns out, I had all 5 of those professors both semesters of my freshman year. And they helped me do that reconstruction. They helped me to a world of discovery that still I look back on with fondness and genuine awe. You had to have seen Jack Charles in action. If you try to picture an old-style college professor, you will have pictured Jack Charles. Bald, white hair, tweed jacket, leather patches on the sleeves, and a pipe that I'm sure he smoked while he was taking a bath. In fact, it was almost permanently attached to him. He had a pipe holder on his belt. And Jack Charles gets up in a piece of Center Hall that no longer exists as it did, one great big lecture room, and starts talking about European history in September of 1962. He was witty, he was cynical, he was smart, he was engaging. I would have taken any course from Jack Charles. If he taught Spanish, if he taught Persian poetry, if he taught plasma physics, I'd have been there. He was my guy, and remained so for the 4 years I was here. Bob Harvey, class of 1925, smoked a cigarette every second of every day, walked into our English class, and simply kept talking about 1920s writers, the writers of his youth. Some we read, like Hemingway. Others he talked about, like William Carlos Williams. Who in the hell would name his kid that, I thought? I mean, I'm William, but only one. But at any rate, Bob Harvey simply loved books. And it came through with every pace and every puff in one of those squeaky, with the floorboard squeaking classrooms over in Center Hall. But Bob was also the college registrar. And once a week, our class of, I don't know, 15 or 20 students would break into smaller groups. We would go to the top floor of Lilly Library then, and we would sit in the archive room of the college with big leather chairs and wonderful old books all around, and we would simply talk about literature. We'd read one another our papers about Hamlet, about Catcher in the Rye, and other things, and we simply talked about literature in this wonderful and elegant setting. I never thought talking about literature could be fun. I'd known it was interesting, I just didn't know what kind of pleasure it could give me. And Bob gave me the pleasure of good books. Jim Barnes was my section leader of CC, which meant a history of contemporary civilization. As I said, Jim arrived at the same time I did. The first book assigned was a book by a guy named Herbert J. Muller. Most of you might not remember the first book you read and didn't understand, but I remember mine. I was sort of a history, social studies guy in high school and had an award to prove it. And I read Uses of the Past, and I was clueless. Not any idea what this guy was talking about. It was a book about, well, oddly enough, the uses of the past. Most of his examples were from the Byzantine Empire, wherever and whenever in the hell that was. And I thought, oops, I don't know as much as I thought I knew. I'm not as sophisticated as I thought, but Jim Barnes tells me this is an important and engaging text and an important and engaging subject, and I better try to figure it out. And for the next 4 years, Jim helped me figure out that and many other things. Because in that course, perhaps more than any other, I learned about the power of ideas. Whether it was the idea of Athenian democracy, or I remember the general lecture by Vic Powell on the Roman Republic, whether it was this crazy period we call the Middle Ages, or the Renaissance, or 19th century Europe. Ideas were interesting. Ideas were fascinating. That I might be able to rattle off every president of the United States and some of their wives, but who gave a damn? This was about something much more and much greater than that. Now, Jim was my advisor. And let me tell you a story that reminds us that we don't just learn from our professors in the classroom. I was sitting in Jim's office one day, and he was doing his good, let's get some background on this new kid kind of stuff, talking about where I was from, what my parents did, all that sort of stuff. And somehow or other, we ended up talking about the fact that I don't have very good eyesight. And I was sort of moaning that I barely could pass the driver's test, something my children don't believe I've ever done legally, even to this day, by the way. And Jim is sympathizing with my problem, and all of a sudden I say, wait a minute, this guy can't see at all. Jim Barnes is blind. And I was taken for the first of many times at that moment by his greatness of spirit, by his generosity. A couple years later, I went to Indianapolis to a conference with Jim. We rode on the Greyhound bus. I didn't have my driver's license then, actually. And I didn't know what this was going to be like. And the thing that so struck me with Jim, that does to this very day, is that Jim knows exactly how to ask for help and what help he needs and when he doesn't need help. And I came from that good old sort of Indiana peasant stock that said, by God, you just grit your teeth and do things by yourself when things get tough. And there was a greatness to Jim that I learned. I don't know if I imitated it, but at least I can recognize it. And it was a wonderful and wondrous thing. Let me tell you about biology. I was not a biology guy. And Elliot Churchill Williams, my professor, was a pretty tough guy. He was Marine sergeant in the guise of a biology professor. And one of the things I remember is that I broke my arm in a, let's not go into detail, event at the Lambda Chi house. Now, I don't know what you guys do in biology now, but we used to actually cut up things. I wasn't good at cutting up with things two-handed. And I'm certainly not good at cutting up things one-handed. And so we had a little box of tools. And I would take the toolbox, put the leg of the frog under it, clump down with my cast, and saw away at the frog with the other hand. It was not a pretty sight, but I thought at least would invoke some sympathy. Bugsy Williams comes by, looks at it and says, God damn it, Cook, that's the messiest frog I've ever seen. By the way, it's not just professors you remember. Watching that scene, sitting directly across from me, was another freshman named David Kendall, who's become my lifelong friend, and of course, a very famous, perhaps the most famous of all Wabash alumni, having been Bill Clinton's attorney through most of his career, and now also Hillary Clinton's attorney. So David Kendall became my friend, and 2 years later, David Kendall spent his summer in Mississippi in 1964, what we call Freedom Summer. And we talked about it a great deal when he came back, and I didn't get it. Because then, I didn't get the civil rights movement very well. But again, one of those things I knew is that if David Kendall is committed to it, I better take it seriously, because he's a person who demands to be taken seriously. And I learned about the civil rights movement and began to examine it at Wabash. I'm glad the guy that watched my frog incident was David Kendall. Dick Strawn was my French professor and linguistics professor. He was one of the very funniest people I've ever met. But he also showed me another kind of wonder. First of all, I went from high school English to reading Waiting for Godot, that is to say, On entend Godot in French. It didn't make any sense in English. Try French. By the way, a few years later, an original translation by Dick Strawn was performed here at Wabash. But what I remember is I was in a fairly advanced French class, and of course we were all jabbering away in French. And one day, this will date us all, we had a lesson on the typewriter. And Dick was going to take us through all the gizmos that make up a typewriter en français. And we got to some obscure piece, and he couldn't remember the French word and became virtually apoplectic. I'd never seen anybody get that excited over a typewriter part in any language. But again, it was a wondrous discovery I made. His interest, his passion, his concern for his own perfection. And I took a linguistics course from Dick, and we did the most extraordinary thing. We had a student here named Armand Luhahi, who spoke English and Swahili and a tribal language in Africa. And he was hired by the college to be our subject in linguistics. And what we had to do without speaking English was to get him to say things in his language to see if we could reconstruct the language. I remember going crazy because you'd point to something blue and he'd say a word, and you'd point to something green and he would say the same damn word. I mean, this is before we knew about all that gray stuff about the Eskimos. And Dick led us through this extraordinary experience. This experience that showed me in still another dimension how big the world was, and how little of it I understood, and how little it I had even been curious about until I got to Wabash. Wabash had required chapel when I was a freshman. And I remember Dean Ben Rogie, you've all been in his lounge. By the way, that's how you know you're old, when half the things around a campus are named for people you knew. The other way is when you get your alumni magazine and look at the obituaries first, okay? Those are the two definitions of being old. Ben Rogie got up at this very podium and talked about the kind of faculty members that Wabash College sought. And the phrase he used, I remember it, he said, we look for people who were driven to teach, people who simply wouldn't be happy doing anything else. And that was true of Jack Charles, of Bob Harvey, Jim Barnes, Bugsy Williams, Dick Strawn, and a lot of others, some well-remembered, some not so well-remembered. The other chapel I remember was a very controversial chapel because we had an outside speaker named Herb Philbrick, a name that will mean nothing to most of you. Herb Philbrick, keep in mind this is 1962, this is Cold War. Herb Philbrick had been a double agent for the FBI. He had infiltrated the Communist Party. And they made a TV show about him called I Led 3 Lives. His life as a commie, his life as a good guy, and his life as a dad. Okay, those were the 3 lives. And I'd watch this TV show, and here comes Herb Philbrick. And Herb Philbrick gets to this podium and gives his very traditional sort of anti-communist spiel. They're all out to get us. They're going to take over the world if we aren't careful, and better dead than red. To pretty big applause, including mine. But there were some people sitting in that balcony right up there, that was where the faculty sat, who were not applauding. And one of them, a sort of new professor whom I never had in class named Ron Santoni, was outside picketing, which, by the way, drew the attention of the Indianapolis Star to no one's surprise. Wabash had pinkos on the faculty. And again, I didn't know Ron Santoni, he was a philosophy professor. But what he was telling me was not so much that Herb Philbrick's a jerk, although that may have been true. He was telling me there's more than one way to look at this topic. That when we hear something from this podium, or any podium, we don't just write it down and file it away for future use. We examine it. We think about it. We struggle with it. We invite other points of view. And that was a very important lesson for me. My dad was a World War II veteran. His father was a career military officer. And so I sort of came from a place where you got stuff and received it and wrote it down and kept it and said, yes, sir, and went on to the next topic. And I learned that that isn't the way that one should live a life. Let me skip forward to my senior year. It got off to a hell of a start. First of all, as I was just reminiscing a few minutes ago, I was over scavenging, I think that's the right word, in Center Hall for faculty to come to the Lambda Chi house so we could impress the freshmen about how many faculty we knew. And And I was hunting down Eric Dean in the religion department, and I walked by an office with some new kid in there, so I went in and introduced myself. It turned out to be Professor Raymond Williams. And so I lured him to the Lambda Chi house. The night before classes began, there was an extraordinary event on campus, the Great God Debate. And the two debaters were a philosopher named Larry Hackstaff and a physicist named Lou Salter. He had a pretty good career here at Wabash. Larry Hackstaff started out by presenting Lou Salter with the golden rule, a ruler that was painted gold. And so we had the debate about God. That was an important lesson to me. Because you know how it is when you're writing papers and taking exams. I started in college in 1962 and have never left. So I know a lot about this stuff from both sides of the aisle. This is where I learned that deep and profound exploration of serious issues just can be fun. It is interesting, it's entertaining, it was good-humored, it need not be bleak. And that was an important lesson as I entered that senior year. I have to tell a story about Jim Barnes that Jim probably doesn't know. I did what would now be called a senior thesis with Jim. And it was due in January. Our term ended in the middle of January. And like most seniors, I spent 2 all-nighters in a row to get the damn thing finished. And so in my pajamas, I go over to Baxter Hall, then brand new, to slide this under Jim's door and go back and sleep for about 20 hours. And Jim was there. And I handed him the paper. Dr. Barnes, here's my paper. Fine. Oh, by the way, Bill, could you sit down and read it to me? I was so damn tired and in my jammies. And I'm reading a paper about the Oxford University Reform Act of 1854, which is about 30 pages long. And Jim would say, excuse me, let me interrupt. What was that footnote? Or how in the hell how did you draw that conclusion? I don't know. I did it in a stupor. My PhD was all downhill from there, let me tell you. In January of 1966, I climbed aboard, this will really date me, the Monon Railroad to ride to Chicago for a graduate school interview. And when I got on the train, I saw Lou Salter, whom I'd never had in class, but knew because that's the way Wabash is. And I sat down with Lou Salter. We talked for 4 hours on the way to Chicago. And at that time, one of the big issues with the fraternities in general was the acceptance of non-white and even non-Christian students. Some of the national fraternities had a white clause, some didn't. But I can tell you when I was here, to my shame, only one of the 9 fraternities had African American students. That was the Teaks. And this was a topic that somehow Lou and I got on. And again, I was a fairly traditional kind of pretty conservative, fairly narrow-minded, even as a senior in some ways. And every comment I made, Lou very articulately simply took completely apart. And I came back a couple days later, also on the Monon, but without Lou, really a changed person. The good news was that Wabash had prepared me to learn, and more good news was that there was Lou Salter. The bad news was I was a senior and I hadn't learned a lot of this stuff yet. But I learned it that day on the Monon Railroad. Damn it, we got to win. I want that bell here next year. Because I believe in the Monon as well as believing in Wabash. The Monon bell means something special to me. And that very spring, we had a situation in the Lambda Chi house where there was a non-white, an Asian student that some wanted to pledge and some saw as somebody we shouldn't pledge. And I stood up for that student. And we pledged him. And he is my dear friend and one-time cover boy of the Wabash alumni magazine, Dr. Frank Ling. And I wasn't proud of what I achieved. I was proud of what Wabash had allowed me to become and evolve into. I want to tell you briefly two other things that happened in my senior year. One is that our Glee Club made a trip to Peoria. And we sang mostly for an alumni group, and we had some prospective Wabash students there. And that night, I met an 18-year-old skinny kid, urged him to come to Wabash. I think he did. His name is Bill Plaker. And in April of my senior year, the religion department, I was sort of a quasi-religion minor, had a speaker from England named John A.T. Robinson, a sort of best-selling, if you can imagine that, theologian. And for 2 weeks, he came to the class in modern theology I did with Eric Dean. He came to the Lambda Chi House, which he described as looking rather like the YMCA. I don't think that was a compliment, by the way. And I actually made an hour-long radio interview with him on WNDY, which, alas, no longer exists in the college archives. And this was the first time I really began to explore theology and theological issues. And I never lost that interest. John A.T. Robinson, I remember him very well saying, "Here's a book you ought to read." You know, you hear that all the time. I read the damn thing. It was a novel by a Romanian. I read it again last summer after a 40-year gap. It's still a brilliant book that speaks to my heart as well as my mind. And Wabash has the resources to make events like John A.T. Robinson happen. Let me give you a list of my roommates. Not by name, but by profession. I had a roommate who became a lawyer, a doctor, a priest, a social worker, an advertising executive, another damn medieval historian, an airline pilot, a mathematician, a label writer, a baseball executive, and I say with profound sadness, a bum. A guy who is almost now homeless and has been, in the past, the victim of very serious alcoholism. But all of those folks, from the most to the least successful, are the friends of my life. Made easier now, as you all know, because you take it for granted, with email and all the other wonders of modern communication. But people, I can tell you where they are and what they're doing 40 years later, because they were also part of the fabric of my transformation. Let me make a couple criticisms of my Wabash education. I think Wabash, like most colleges, was probably somewhat self-absorbed and insular. After all, the only daily newspaper we got at the Lambda Chi House was the Crawfordsville Journal-Review. It's a step or two away from the New York Times, or 4, or never mind, we don't want to go into numbers here. Let me suggest my own example of insularity. On the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, I walked into the Scarlet Inn after a French class. And the woman behind the counter said, "The president's been shot." And I said, "Who would want to shoot Byron Trippett?" Now that's insular. It's absolutely true. I remember when one of my fellow seniors spoke at this podium when I was a senior at Required Chapel. He was talking about the Wabash insularity, and perhaps raising more eyebrows then than he would now. He said, "A lot of what we do, gentlemen, is intellectual masturbation." Well, there's a certain truth to that, if you think about it. So I think it is important, and I'm sure that in many ways Wabash is different and less insular and more open, and I think more intellectual than it was when I was here, and I rejoice in that. I think, too, I learned many things from many people, but in the classroom, there was, I think, too little attempt to connect what we were studying with what's happening in the world right then. We got that at the round tables of the Scarlet Inn. I just got some this morning, in fact. We got that in our fraternity chats. We got that in faculty offices. We got very little of it in the classroom. I would imagine that's not so true now, and I hope it is not so true. Well, I turned out different than what I planned. Again, I graduated from Wabash, but I went on to get a PhD and become a historian. By the way, quite a different kind of historian than either Jack Charles or Jim Barnes, even though I learned enormous amounts from them. I switched from being a Republican to being a Democrat, and in 1998 I ran for Congress, following in the footsteps of my political science professor, Carl Olesker, who ran for Congress against Congressman Wabash, that's a Wabash name, in 1964, during the time I had him in class. I was a white guy from a white neighborhood, and now I have a family that's as untraditional and unwhite as it can be. I'm single, but all my kids but one are people of color. An African American, Asians, Puerto Ricans. It's not exactly what I had in mind of what Christmas table would look like when I came to Crawfordsville. I, of course, don't live in the suburbs of Indianapolis. I live in upstate New York, although I live in a town that makes Crawfordsville look positively cosmopolitan. I'm no longer an Episcopalian. I'm a very active layman in the Roman Catholic tradition. None of those changes happened while I was here, and none of those changes, except the professional one, happened for quite a while after I left Wabash. God knows what's coming next. I'm only 64. But I doubt if any of it would have occurred had I not gone to Wabash. I didn't learn how to be a Democrat or how to be a Catholic or how to be in anything at Wabash. I listened to faculty members. I spent time with people who were deeply learned and truly great human beings. People whose minds you not only wanted to emulate, but also their conduct and their hearts. That's the kind of greatness the Wabash faculty had. You need to know who your Strawns and Barnes and Williamses and Charleses are, because you all have them. And what I would leave as a parting message is, although you will recollect them many times in the rest of your life, which will stretch far into the 21st century, but the sooner you appreciate what they bring to you, the sooner you reflect on all the things you have to learn from them, as well as from your classmates, as well as from the guest speakers that the college has, the greater will be your education as the next generation of the men of Wabash College. Thank you very much. This is the closest I've ever get to an encore, so I'm going to give you an encore. It's going to take 30 seconds. It's a Jack Charles story. When I was a senior, standing at this podium was the Grand Mufti of Syria. I did not know what a mufti, grand or otherwise, was, but he was the Grand Mufti of Syria and gave a very interesting talk. And afterwards, I went to a class with Jack Charles. And Jack Charles raised this question. If in Rome the pontiff pontificates, does a mufti mufticate?